July 1942, Kokoda Track, Papua New Guinea. The jungle was dying, not from disease or fire, but from thousands of boots crushing every leaf and vine in their path. Japanese soldiers moved south like a dark wave, unstoppable and certain. Behind them lay conquered cities. Ahead of them lay Australia itself, just 100 miles of mountain and mud away. The sound of their advance filled the air. Rifles clicked. Orders barked in sharp Japanese. Somewhere in the green darkness, men were running for their lives. The Australian 39th Battalion had started with 800 young men. Now only 300 remained. They had retreated for 3 weeks straight. Every day brought the same pattern. They would dig positions on a ridge. The Japanese would attack from the front. Then enemy soldiers would appear behind them, like magic, cutting off escape routes. Then came the order every man dreaded. Fall back, retreat, run. The Japanese war machine had crushed Singapore in weeks. It had swept through Malaya like a storm. Now it was doing the same thing here, and nothing seemed able to stop it. In Port Moresby, American generals studied maps in comfortable buildings. General Douglas MacArthur himself commanded from Australia, planning grand strategies with fresh American divisions. His staff officers spoke with confidence about firepower and artillery. They talked about how modern American tactics would win the war. Meanwhile, on the Kokoda track, Australian militia soldiers died in the mud, forgotten and alone. The Americans had the weapons, the supplies, the fame, but none of that mattered here, where you could not see 10 feet ahead through the vines and rain. The old rules of war meant nothing in this jungle. Machine guns were useless when you could not see the enemy. Artillery could not hit targets hidden under triple canopy forest. Radios barely worked in the constant rain. Supply lines stretched so thin that soldiers went days without food. American officers kept pushing for defensive lines, the kind that worked in Europe. Build trenches, set up fields of fire, hold positions with superior firepower. But every position the Australians built became a trap. The Japanese simply walked through the jungle and attacked from behind. It was like fighting ghosts who knew every secret path through the green hell. The Australian soldiers themselves were considered second-rate. MacArthur's staff called them chocolate soldiers, men who would melt under pressure. They were militia, not regular army. Many had never fired a rifle in combat before landing in Papua. American advisors shook their heads and waited for real troops, professional soldiers from the United States, to arrive and win the war properly. Nobody in Port Moresby seemed to understand that while they waited, Australia was about to fall. Among the 300 exhausted survivors of the 39th Battalion, one man saw things differently. Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honner was 40 years old. He had been a schoolteacher before the war, teaching history and mathematics to children in Sydney. His father had fought in the First World War and came home speaking rarely about what he had seen. Honner had joined the army, expecting to follow rules and orders, to do his duty quietly. But 3 weeks of watching men die had changed something in him. He was not a flashy leader. He did not give inspiring speeches. Instead, he watched. He studied. He thought like the teacher he had been, analyzing patterns and searching for lessons in the chaos. Every night, Honner reviewed what had happened that day. He questioned survivors about Japanese tactics. How many soldiers attacked? From which direction? What time? How did they move so quietly? He collected every piece of intelligence, every small detail. Other officers saw defeat. Honner saw data. He noticed that Japanese patrols moved at the same times each day. He saw that they relied on speed and surprise, not overwhelming numbers. He realized they expected the Australians to fight like Europeans, standing and trading fire until one side broke. The Japanese had perfect tactics for defeating that kind of enemy. But Honner started to understand something his commanders in Port Moresby did not. The jungle itself was not neutral ground. It was not just an obstacle that made everything harder. The jungle was a weapon. And like any weapon, it could be used by whoever understood it best. The Japanese had been using the jungle to hide their movements, to appear where they were not expected, to attack from impossible angles. They moved through terrain that maps said was impassable. They carried less equipment and moved faster than anyone thought possible. They had adapted to this new kind of warfare while the Allies clung to old ideas. But Honner saw a crack in their approach. The Japanese used the same paths repeatedly. They expected fear to paralyze their enemies. They assumed Australians would keep retreating forever. What if someone refused to play by those rules? What if someone turned the jungle against them instead? Honner sat in the rain on the night of July 23rd, 1942. Around him, exhausted men slept in mud. Supplies were nearly gone. Orders from headquarters said to fall back again tomorrow. The Japanese would attack at dawn, just like always. But Honner was not thinking about retreat anymore. He was thinking about all those Japanese patrols moving through the darkness, confident and certain. He was thinking about how surprise was their greatest weapon, and he was thinking that any weapon could be taken away and turned around. The jungle had been defeating the Australians because they treated it as an obstacle. The Japanese were winning because they used it as cover. But what if it could become something else entirely? What if the jungle could become a trap for the hunters themselves? Honner called his sergeants together that night and explained his plan in whispers. Instead of waiting for the Japanese to attack, they would strike first, but not in the way anyone expected. He would split his men into tiny groups, just 8 to 12 soldiers each. These small teams would move through parts of the jungle that maps said could not be crossed. They would travel at night when the Japanese felt safest. They would not hold positions. They would appear, kill, and vanish like smoke. The jungle would hide them the same way it hid the enemy, but they would use it better. His sergeants looked at him like he had lost his mind. Attack with 8 men at a time? Move through impossible terrain in complete darkness? Leave defensive positions to crawl through mud and vines? It went against every rule they had learned. One sergeant asked the obvious question: what if the small groups got lost? What if they ran into larger Japanese forces? Honner's answer was simple. The Japanese expected fear. They expected retreat. They would never expect Australian soldiers to hunt them in their own backyard. Surprise was worth more than numbers. The jungle was worth more than guns. And small groups could move silent where large units could not. The first test came 3 nights later near Isurava village. Honner sent 3 teams of 10 men each into the darkness. Their target was a Japanese supply camp that sat 200 meters behind enemy lines. Intelligence said 40 soldiers guarded it. The Australians had studied the Japanese schedule for days. They knew when sentries changed. They knew when officers slept. They knew which paths the enemy used. At midnight, in rain so heavy it drowned out all other sound, the 3 teams crept forward. They moved 1 step at a time, testing each footfall before putting weight down. They breathed through open mouths to stay silent. It took 2 hours to cover 200 meters. The Japanese camp was quiet. Sentries stood under trees, trying to stay dry. Supply crates sat stacked in neat rows. Officers slept in tents. Everything was organized and confident. Then, at exactly 0200 hours, all 3 Australian teams opened fire at once from 3 different directions. The camp exploded in chaos. Japanese soldiers ran for weapons, but could not tell where the shots came from. Some fired into the darkness and hit their own men. Others dove for cover and found Australian rifles already aimed at those spots. The attack lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, 42 Japanese soldiers lay dead. Not one Australian had been hit. The teams melted back into the jungle and were gone before enemy reinforcements arrived. When the sun rose, Honner's scouts watched Japanese officers examine the camp. They saw the confusion on their faces. How had the enemy gotten behind their lines? How had they moved through impassable terrain? How had they vanished so completely? Days later, captured Japanese documents revealed something remarkable. An enemy officer had written that the Australian commander displayed unusual tactical sophistication. Another noted that this was not militia fighting, but something new and dangerous. For the first time, Japanese soldiers on the Kokoda track felt uncertain. Honner expanded his tactics immediately. He positioned ambush teams every 200 to 300 meters along the entire 60-mile track. Each team had a specific job. Some hit supply lines, others attacked patrols. A few just made noise and disappeared, making the Japanese think enemies were everywhere. The results were stunning. For every Australian soldier killed, Honner's forces were killing 3.2 Japanese soldiers. Other Allied units in the Pacific were barely managing 1-to-1. The math was working, but headquarters in Port Moresby did not want to hear about it. Australian High Command kept ordering conventional defensive stands. Hold this ridge, dig in at that village, fight them face to face with proper tactics. American advisors pushed even harder for firepower-based approaches. They said the Australians just needed more machine guns, more artillery, more ammunition. They insisted that modern warfare was about superior weapons, not sneaking through jungles like bandits. Supplies that could have gone to Honner's battalion were instead prioritized for American divisions training in Australia. His men were fighting on 60 rounds of ammunition per rifle, while US soldiers trained with 200. It was maddening. Then General Thomas Blamey saw the casualty reports. Blamey commanded all Australian ground forces, and he understood numbers. He looked at what Honner was achieving with almost no support and made a decision that changed everything. He diverted scarce ammunition directly to the 39th Battalion. He sent medical supplies up the Kokoda track on the backs of native carriers. He told his staff to leave Honner alone and let him fight his own way. It was not much help, but it was enough to keep going. In September 1942, the real test came at Brigade Hill. Japanese commanders had gathered 1,800 soldiers for a major push. They planned to smash through the Australian lines and reach Port Moresby within a week. Honner had 400 men to stop them. No artillery, no air support. Each soldier had enough food for 1 meal per day. Ammunition was rationed to 60 rounds per man. By every conventional measure, the position was hopeless. The Japanese should have walked right through, but Honner did not fight conventionally. During the day, his men held the ridgeline and traded fire with the enemy below. This was expected. The Japanese prepared for a nighttime flanking attack, their favorite tactic. What they did not expect was that Honner was preparing the same thing. As darkness fell, he sent teams through the jungle on both sides of the Japanese position. Small groups moving silent through terrain the enemy thought secured. All night long, the Japanese heard gunfire from unexpected directions. Their officers shouted orders, but could not tell friend from enemy in the darkness. Supplies disappeared. Sentries vanished. Confusion spread like poison. For 5 days and nights, Honner's 400 men held 1,800 Japanese soldiers in place. They did not win by firepower. They won by making the enemy afraid of the dark. They won by turning the jungle into a weapon that cut both ways. They won by refusing to fight the way they were supposed to fight. When reinforcements finally arrived, the Japanese advance had been stopped cold. The time bought by Brigade Hill allowed the Allies to bring up fresh troops and supplies. The tide of the war in Papua had turned on a muddy hillside where 400 schoolteachers and farmers had outthought professional soldiers. The numbers told a story that no one could ignore. In the first 4 weeks of fighting on the Kokoda track, the Japanese had advanced 60 miles toward Port Moresby. They had crushed every defense the Australians put up. Their momentum seemed unstoppable. But after Honner's tactics spread through the Australian forces, everything changed. The Japanese were pushed back that same 60 miles in just 6 weeks, even though they had received fresh reinforcements. The difference was not in weapons or numbers. The difference was in how the Australians fought. Word spread fast through the jungle camps. Soldiers who had been retreating for months suddenly had a way to win. By November 1942, Australian commanders up and down the line were adopting Honner's methods. Every battalion in Papua received training in infiltration tactics. Sergeants who had fought with Honner taught other units how to move silently, how to read the jungle, how to attack from darkness. 7,000 Australian troops learned to fight the new way. The Japanese, who had grown confident in their superiority, now faced an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. Their own tactics, which had worked so well for months, were being used against them with devastating effect. The Japanese response revealed just how deeply Honner's methods had shaken them. Captured documents and diaries showed a new kind of fear spreading through their ranks. One Japanese major wrote in his personal journal about the fighting at Eora Creek. He described the Australian commander there as possessing a dangerous understanding of Japanese methods. He wrote that Australian troops now attacked like ghosts, appearing from nowhere. He recommended extreme caution to any units ordered to face these forces. This was extraordinary. Japanese soldiers had conquered half of Asia. They were elite troops, hardened veterans who feared nothing. Yet here they were, writing warnings about an Australian schoolteacher and his band of militia soldiers. The difference became clear when comparing battles. At Buna, American forces used conventional tactics, the kind taught in military schools. They launched frontal assaults with heavy firepower. They relied on superior equipment and numbers. The battle cost them 2,800 casualties to kill 1,400 Japanese. The Americans won, but the price was terrible. At Gona, just miles away, Honner led an assault using his infiltration methods. His forces took 400 casualties while killing 900 Japanese defenders. Same enemy, same jungle, different tactics, different results. The math was undeniable. The most vivid proof came during a midnight engagement at Eora Creek in October. Rain hammered down so hard it felt like standing under a waterfall. The darkness was total, the kind where you could not see your own hand in front of your face. Japanese sentries stood guard, straining to hear anything over the roar of water on leaves. They knew Australian forces were nearby, but felt secure in their defensive positions. Then, without warning, rifle fire cracked out from 3 different directions at once. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness for split seconds, then vanished. The Japanese fired back wildly, hitting trees and shadows. Some soldiers shot their own comrades in the confusion. Officers screamed orders that no one could hear over the rain and gunfire. More shots came from behind them now, then from the left, then silence. When they finally organized and searched the area at dawn, they found no bodies, no blood, no evidence except their own dead. The Australians had attacked, killed, and disappeared like they had never been there at all. This psychological effect proved almost as powerful as the physical casualties. Japanese units began overestimating the size of forces they faced. Patrols reported encountering thousands of Australians when the actual number was in the hundreds. Company commanders requested reinforcements against enemy divisions that were really just battalions. Fear multiplied numbers in the darkness. When soldiers cannot see their enemy clearly, when attacks come from unexpected directions, when the jungle itself seems hostile, imagination does the rest. The Japanese had used this same psychological warfare against others for years. Now it was being turned back on them with interest. Some Japanese officers tried to counter Honner's tactics by being more aggressive. They sent larger patrols through the jungle. They increased nighttime security. They tried to predict where Australian ambushes might wait. But this only made things worse. Larger patrols were easier to hear coming. Extra sentries meant more targets for Australian marksmen. Every countermeasure the Japanese attempted seemed to play into Honner's hands. He had studied them so thoroughly that he knew what they would do before they did it. It was like playing chess against someone who had memorized all your moves. The success of Honner's methods could not be hidden or denied. By 1943, as fighting moved to the Huon Peninsula, 15,000 Australian troops had been trained in his infiltration tactics. Entire divisions operated using principles he had developed on that desperate retreat along the Kokoda track. The Australian Army produced training manuals based on his techniques. Officers who had dismissed him as unorthodox now praised his genius. Even American commanders, who had initially resisted jungle warfare tactics, began studying what the Australians were doing. The statistics from the Huon Peninsula campaign showed the full impact. When Japanese forces faced Australian units trained in Honner's methods, their casualties increased by 40% compared to earlier fighting. This was not because the Australians had better weapons or more soldiers. The Japanese actually had strengthened their defenses and learned from earlier defeats. But none of that mattered when the enemy refused to fight the expected way. The jungle warfare that Honner pioneered had become the standard for Pacific combat. What started as one desperate man's attempt to save 300 soldiers had transformed how an entire theater of war was fought. Perhaps the most telling detail came from Japanese prisoners of war. When interrogated, many asked which Australian unit had captured them. If told it was a formation trained by or associated with Honner, they nodded with grim understanding. Some even showed a strange kind of relief, as if being defeated by a worthy opponent was better than admitting they had lost to inferior forces. They did not speak his name with hatred, but with respect. The kind of respect soldiers give to commanders who beat them fairly through skill rather than just overwhelming force. Honner continued commanding troops through 1944, leading Australian forces in some of the hardest fighting of the Pacific War. But when peace finally came in 1945, he did not stay in the military. He returned to teaching, walking back into classrooms as if the previous years had been just a brief interruption. He rarely spoke about the war. When former soldiers found him and wanted to share stories, he listened politely but offered little in return. He had done what needed doing. Now it was done. That was enough for him. The Australian government awarded him the Distinguished Service Order for his actions, but the medal sat in a drawer, not displayed on any wall. Fame had never interested Ralph Honner. Results had. What Honner could not have known was that his ideas would outlive him by generations. The Australian Army took his field tactics and turned them into official doctrine. Every soldier training for jungle warfare studied principles that Honner had worked out in the mud and darkness of Papua. His approach was written down, refined, and taught to thousands. The manual he helped create became the foundation for how Australia would train special forces for the next 50 years. When Australian commandos deployed to Vietnam, Malaya, or anywhere else the jungle grew thick, they carried Honner's lessons with them. But the influence spread far beyond Australia. In the 1960s, when the United States found itself fighting in the jungles of Vietnam, American officers quietly studied what had worked in Papua decades earlier. They read reports about Australian tactics. They interviewed veterans who had served under Honner. The lessons were clear. Heavy firepower meant nothing when you could not see the enemy. Large units moved too slowly and made too much noise. Small teams, intimate knowledge of terrain, and the willingness to fight unconventionally were worth more than any amount of equipment. Some American units adapted these ideas and saw immediate results. Others ignored them and paid terrible prices. The ideas jumped continents and changed contexts, but remained true. Israeli forces in the 1970s adapted Honner's infiltration tactics for desert warfare. The principle was the same, even though the setting was different. Use the terrain as a weapon. Move in small groups. Attack from unexpected directions. Create fear through unpredictability. The British Special Air Service incorporated his methods into their training, recognizing that the tactical genius was not specific to jungles, but universal to any environment where conventional forces struggled. Russian special forces studied the Kokoda campaign and drew their own lessons. A schoolteacher from Sydney had accidentally created a blueprint for how small, motivated forces could defeat larger, better-equipped enemies anywhere in the world. This did not seem to bother him. He had never sought glory. He had sought victory, and he had achieved it. When Honner died in 1994, at the age of 92, something remarkable happened. Japanese veterans who had fought in Papua contacted his family. They requested permission to attend his funeral. Some traveled from Japan specifically to pay respects to the man who had defeated them. They bowed before his casket with genuine reverence. This was the ultimate tribute a soldier could receive, recognition from the men who had faced him across the battlefield and found him worthy. They did not come because he had killed many of them. They came because he had beaten them fairly through superior thinking. In the Code of Warriors, this mattered more than any medal a government could award. The lessons Honner taught go far beyond military tactics. His story reveals something fundamental about how innovation happens. He succeeded because he was willing to abandon what everyone knew was right. Conventional wisdom said you needed firepower and numbers. Honner proved you needed understanding and adaptability. Experts said you could not fight effectively in the jungle with small units and limited supplies. Honner showed that limitations could become advantages if you thought differently. The shortage of ammunition forced him to be creative. The lack of artillery made him develop better tactics. This pattern appears throughout history and continues today. Modern asymmetric warfare in Afghanistan and Iraq followed Honner's template exactly. Small insurgent forces with minimal equipment defeated larger, technologically superior armies by using terrain knowledge and psychological warfare. They understood what Honner had proven in 1942. Firepower alone cannot win wars. The side that adapts faster, thinks more clearly, and refuses to follow expected patterns will triumph over the side that relies on conventional strength. The weapons change. The locations change. Human nature stays the same. Perhaps the deepest lesson is about the difference between fame and respect. General MacArthur became one of the most famous commanders in history. His image appeared on magazine covers. His name was known worldwide. Statues and memorials preserve his memory. But captured Japanese diaries did not express fear of MacArthur or any American commander in the Pacific. They feared the quiet Australian who fought like a ghost and thought like a chess master. Real respect is not measured in publicity or official honors. It is measured in the private admissions of defeated enemies who acknowledged they faced someone truly exceptional. History has a way of remembering the loud and forgetting the effective. We build monuments to generals who gave stirring speeches while overlooking the ones who actually won battles. We celebrate the commanders with the best public relations while ignoring those who earned genuine fear and respect from their opponents. Ralph Honner never sought the spotlight. He sought victory through intelligence, creativity, and the courage to abandon failed methods. In the end, he achieved something rare and valuable. He became the enemy that even his enemies respected. The jungle fighting in Papua New Guinea lasted only months, but the principles Honner discovered there proved eternal. Small forces can defeat large ones. Unconventional thinking beats superior firepower. Adaptability matters more than equipment. And the greatest tribute a warrior can receive is not a medal from his own side, but the quiet admission from the other side that facing him was their worst fear. That is the legacy of a schoolteacher who became a legend not through glory, but through making his enemies write in their own diaries that he was the one commander they truly dreaded to face.